architecture and interiors firm. We focus on the adaptive reuse of existing buildings. We have a very kind of macro to micro approach. On the macro side, we're very kind of community oriented. We do a lot of work with the city and agencies to come up with new policies. And on the micro side, all the way down, we're really involved in, even custom furniture and lighting and how a space feels, which is, by the way, what Omgivning means. It's a Swedish word that means how a space feels. So we have about 40 staff. We're located in downtown LA. We've touched about 400 buildings at this point. So I'm going to start before we get into the actual code that Joel's going to focus on. You can go to the next slide, Joel. I'm going to focus on kind of a case study, which is showing how we use the California Historical Building Code to create a document that incentivizes the reuse of commercial buildings in order to revitalize a historic district. Well, there's a lot there, so I'm going to kind of explain the whole process. So basically, this is the initiative is called Bringing Back Broadway. So it's about the revitalization of Broadway. So Broadway is Los Angeles's historic commercial entertainment district. It's basically one street that's about 9 long blocks, and it really saw a major decline in the 1960s through the 90s, kind of as modernism happened and the freeways happened and a host of other reasons why our kind of historic core started to decline. So in 1999, there was an adaptive reuse ordinance, and that was a major coup to kind of helping us, revitalize our historic core. But it was primarily for apartments and some hotels, and we weren't really seeing any impact on Broadway because Broadway was a very different type of street. The other streets had kind of L-shaped or C-shaped buildings. They were offices on the upper floors from the 20s, and so they really converted very easily to residential. But Broadway, because it was entertainment and commercial, these buildings were generally bigger. They had storage on the upper floors, or they were big department stores. So they didn't necessarily have a lot of light and ventilation that made it easy for residential. So in 2008, there was a organization formed called Bringing Back Broadway, and it was a public-private partnership, and it was kind of led and begun by our local council member. So, and the goals of that initiative was to provide economic development and business assistance. It was a very wide kind of net that we were trying to do because there's a lot of different things within that, but economic development, encourage historic preservation, reactivate the historic theaters and the many underutilized commercial buildings. At that point, there was over 2 million square feet of empty upper floor space just sitting there, and increase transit, develop a streetcar. So there was a master plan for streetscape. There was a district design guide overlay. There was a streetcar. There was a facade lighting program. There was a sign district to bring back historic signs. And then the thing I'm going to talk about here is the commercial reuse guidelines. So it was how can we really bring back the use to these 2 million square feet above. So the process, so it was a daunting process, let's just put it that way. So first we started with case studies. So we tried to analyze the different types of buildings and to find some kind of consistent code issues that maybe we could deal with. But it was very complicated because some were high rise, some were low rise, some were residential, some were assembly, some were there's just a huge mix of building types and uses. And so it was very hard when we were trying to put it all into one bucket of how we could kind of improve the code or whatever. So the picture at the bottom shows the kind of 5-year process where we were just, the picture kind of shows it. It was just like trying to push this massive stone up a huge hill. So we kind of changed direction, and the change of the direction was, hey, we have this state code that is specifically for historic buildings, and you know, as being an architect that does a lot of buildings, obviously in Los Angeles, I would often try to use that code, and very often I would be denied, you know, or the building department would just say, oh, well, you know, we don't accept that code, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, as one person, I couldn't really do anything about it. So I said, well, why don't we try to get everybody, you know, the building department, the fire department, and the council office, and we had two architects, us and another, that had more boots on the ground to really understand the issues with the buildings and the code and what was difficult, and to look at the historic building code and try to interpret the things that were, because there's a lot of language that's kind of vague, and so to interpret it and to create a document then that is more based on the specific building types in this district. So I don't know if that makes sense, but it was complicated. Then once we decided that was going to be the process, because also if you're interpreting an existing code, you're not changing a code. So therefore it should be a much easier process, because if you try to change a code, that's pretty much impossible. But then right away we ran into a block of the building department, the fire department saying that, you know, that they weren't required to use this code. And so we had to get the city attorney involved, and it became this whole thing with the state and other cities. And then it was finally determined, yes, Los Angeles Fire Department and Los Angeles Building and Safety must use this code. So then once we were kind of all in the same playing field, then we really did some great work of working together, having a common path to try to come up with a document to incentivize this development. And then the next slide. So the actual document, I think it's like 30 or 40 pages or something like that. And we separated the buildings into different categories. So if it was like not a change of use and it was more of just like a renovation, that would be like the lowest category. And then there was two categories above that. So there's one, if you have an assembly occupancy, because obviously that really increases the hazard of the building, and or if you're changing the use of the building. So we categorized the aspects of the code, and then we basically, took the California Historical Building Code and cited certain areas, a lot of areas or actual codes, and then did an interpretation next to it that might apply specifically to some of these buildings. Sometimes we just listed it down. Next slide. And then I think, so the Bring Back Broadway initiative as a whole was very successful, although I think it has been stalled here a little bit, plus there's some other downtown issues we're dealing with, but it did incentivize over $1 billion of investment, which was fantastic. And we do have this commercial reuse bulletin, which can impact developers and owners, architects and plan checkers, so that everyone's kind of on the same page when they're looking at how to use the California Historical Building Code with these types of buildings. Some of the main incentivizing or the things that had the most impact, I think, were the reactivation of original or former uses. So for example, if there was a restaurant or a cafeteria in a basement, and then it was, it was removed for many, many years, maybe it was storage or something like that, or even parking. So this code says, hey, you can bring back that use. So if that use, so maybe that, restaurant use now and today, maybe somebody wanted to build a bar in the basement. So it's not like you're going to build the exact same thing. It's not about historic preservation, but it's about saying, hey, originally there was a larger gathering of people in the basement, and the exiting might not be perfect, but it's very safe and it's really good. It's usually wider or whatever. And you can bring that back. So that's a big one. My dog is barking. Wait, let me just let him out. Kids, dogs, things you can't control. Another thing that I think was really impacting was fire escapes, because fire escapes are often source of conflict, you know, understandably, because fire escapes can be a little scary as an exit, but you know, they are an exit, and in certain situations, especially if it's smaller occupancies, that you know, we found a happy medium of to be able to keep fire escapes on some of these buildings, because before the city would just say, changing the use of the building, you can't keep the fire escape, sorry, no matter what. So we tried to work it backwards, that you would have, you would work with whatever your exit width is. So say you had a main stair, and then say you had a fire escape. So you would take the exit width of the two stairs or exits that you have, and then kind of work backwards to what a reasonable occupancy would be. Because that's actually how the current code works. Well, there's many aspects of exiting code, but that's a big one, is the exit width based on occupants. So, so for example, the idea was, again, how to activate these upper floors. If you wanted to have, say, a yoga studio or an art gallery or something like that, that's still considered an assembly occupancy, but it's a very low use assembly occupancy. And those were, especially for an urban environment, those are great uses to have on upper floors to occupy these buildings. So that was kind of the intent with that one. The building height increase was, basically, there's more of a Los Angeles thing, I think, but we had a height of 150 feet that most of the historic buildings were built at as a maximum, based on the height of our city hall, so they wouldn't be higher than the city hall. And so we have a lot of buildings that are right up to 150 feet. And 150 feet was also kind of like a higher level of high rise in our city. So as soon as a building was over 150 feet, you had to provide a bunch of additional things. But it was really for a high rise that might be 40 stories, you know, as opposed to 165 feet. So if you have a 150-foot building and you add 1 story or, you know, 1.5 stories on the top, it's going to be a hotel, you're going to occupy the roof or something like that. We tried to, you know, again, with everybody in the room, kind of understanding what's safe and fair and how to, you know, incentivize development, that you could add that 1 story. And for example, you know, water storage and some of the fire protection issues wouldn't trigger this like 40-story building. It would still be under 150-foot level. And then there's, you know, there's a lot of good things that Joel's going to go through in a minute that are very specific about, you know, maybe you don't need to rate a corridor if it's an existing corridor, or if you have glazing, how to deal with that with water curtains and things like that. So yeah, I think that, oh, and unintended consequences. So whenever you're creating a document like that, I can't stress enough how you have to think about every scenario possible. And if you're a city person and you're wanting to put a document together, make sure you get architects or engineers or whoever has the kind of boots on the ground and can look at it from a totally different lens or lenses with different types of buildings, so that you're seeing everything. And so additions, you know, where we had kind of built in a lot of stuff to help if you put an addition on the building, which again, most of these urban historic buildings, because there's no, they're all property line to property line, you want to occupy the roof, plus it's Los Angeles, right? You want to occupy the roof. But the addition in itself with the California Historical Building Code kind of kicks it out of being able to use a lot of the incentives or the code. So now we're kind of running into issues with anything that has an addition at all. Triggers, they kind of want to do full compliance, but, and again, we didn't get into the interpretation of that one section so much, but basically they're saying, you know, kind of a lot or most of the building, or at least the exiting to and from and the systems of the whole building have to be upgraded. So that was kind of an unintended consequence, but I think we should have spent a lot more time on the impact of the additions. I think, is that the end of my section? Yes, and I'm going to hand it over to Joel.
All right, thanks, Karin. Hi, everyone. I'm Joel Chappo with Omgivning. I'm a project manager there. I've been there for almost 6 years, coming up in October. I'm Coming to you live from our satellite office in West Adams in the Los Angeles area, also known as my dining room. But we'll go through 3 case studies of some of our projects staying on the topic on Broadway. And then we'll dive into the historic building code and cover the sections on use and occupancy, fire protection, means of egress, and accessibility. So starting off with some of the case study projects. So this is Broadway Trade. It was built as Hamburger's department store, and then it became the May Company building. It was completed in 1908 with add-ons in 1923 and 1929. It was designed by Alfred Rosenheim and Alexander Kurlit. It's 1.1 million square feet, and our proposed use is a 500,000 square feet of creative office, 150-room hotel, 200,000 square feet that are devoted to retail, restaurants, and a food hall. And then throughout the building, we're removing 55,000 square feet of area to create light courts. We're also proposing a new rooftop with new penthouse structures, a public park, gardens, 2 swimming pools, and 5 restaurants with bars. The next one is, this is the Proper Hotel. So Nell shared the Proper Hotel that was completed in Santa Monica. This is the one that's scheduled to open in downtown Los Angeles. This building originally held the Commercial Club with guest rooms for members. It was kind of a who's who of 1920s LA. Some other things that were, there was also a barber shop, a swimming pool, a gymnasium, and an athletic facility. It's a 13-story Renaissance revival style building that was designed by Alexander Kurlit and Claude Bielman. And we're overseeing the conversion to a 148-room hotel with a restaurant and bar and a amenity area at the roof. We're also incorporating the pool and basketball court at the 7th floor into guest suites. And then the last project that we'll kind of use as a case study is the Broadway Lofts. It was formerly the Bum Miller building, and it held a department store and a succession of theaters for movies and vaudeville performances. It's a 6-story Renaissance revival style building that was designed by Morgan and Wells, and it was completed in 1906. And we completed this conversion from office use to 58 loft apartments, and we used the existing light wells for primary circulation to free up space for the units. So we'll kind of go through, as we're going through the code, we'll kind of reference back to these projects that are on Broadway to show how we were able to include provisions from the historic building code. But first, everyone's favorite thing to kick off a presentation, a general disclaimer for application of the historic building code. So there's typically, we found there's typically no one-size-fits-all kind of method or technique for application of the historic building code. And the interpretations may vary based on the enforcing agency, project type, construction type, and use or occupancy type. So we recommend doing a very early building and code analysis of the building, what is feasible, and the applicable sections of the historic building code. And we also recommend having some very preliminary meetings that are early in the design process with your local code official to discuss the strategy and application. So this exciting image on the right is, so typically one way that we do this in Los Angeles is we'll set up a case management meeting with our plan checker and other agencies, and we'll kind of go through that due diligence that we did and kind of ask how we might be able to incorporate these into our design. And so this exciting paperwork on the right just kind of shows when we're in the plan check process, sometimes we'll process requests for modifications to incorporate sections of the historic building code and provide justifications for alternative methods that we're providing to also meet regular code. Just wanted to go over one definition that is of a distinct hazard. And so the historic building code defines it as any clear and evident condition that exists as an immediate danger to the safety of the occupants or the public right of way. The historic building code also says that conditions that do not meet the requirements of the current regular code and ordinances do not constitute as a distinct hazard. So that was one of the issues when Karin and kind of our office was discussing the Broadway bulletin, is that just because something doesn't meet current code doesn't make it a distinct hazard. So we'll jump into use and occupancy. This is section 3 of the Historic Building Code. So for existing use, the use or character of the occupancy shall be permitted to continue regardless of any period of time in which it may have remained unoccupied. This is something that Karin had mentioned as part of the Broadway bulletin. And so the imagery on the right comes from Broadway Trade. So you see on the lower left, that is the basement level that was being used for parking. But we were able to find historic drawings and photos that showed retail and restaurant use. So there are historic photos shown here to the right of the screen. And so that allowed us to kind of propose and incorporate a restaurant and bar use without triggering a change of use, new area, or parking. With any change in occupancy, so the language in the Historic Building Code says that a change in occupancy shall not mandate conformance with new construction requirements set forth in the regular code. So again, we recommend kind of that early due diligence and early conversations with the enforcing agency just to verify the method and the technique going forward with any change in occupancy. For occupancy separation, so the California Historic Building Code allows any separation of more than 1 hour. It may be reduced to a 1 hour wall construction with a 45-minute opening protection with an automatic sprinkler system throughout. And so the sprinkler system you're going to see is going to be a theme. It's a critical kind of component of the Historic Building Code. And so in a few slides, we'll discuss kind of some of those trade-offs that the sprinklers provide. For maximum floor area, it may be unlimited in floor area without fire-resistive area separation with an automatic sprinkler system. And then maximum height in stories shall not be limited due to the construction type of the building. And that's just provided that it does not exceed the height of the historical design. So on the right is a proposed image I mentioned of Broadway Trade, the proposed rooftop use. So you can kind of see the assembly area, pool. You can kind of just peek at one of the light courts here, and then restaurant with an outdoor market. And so we found a lot of really cool historic photos that showed uses that were up on the roof that included a small stage or theater with performances. And then also this roof nursery, which we thought was really cool. So trying to incorporate those uses back up on the roof. For light and ventilation, so the Historic Building Code says that existing light and ventilation that do not constitute a safety hazard may remain. Typically, for any existing windows that are at the property line, the Los Angeles Fire Department and Department of Building and Safety require a water curtain and wired glass for windows at the property line. So the images on the right come from the proper hotel. The image below is the existing window configuration. And so above, you can kind of see this was the banquet hall. This is a historic photo, but you can kind of see beyond, you can see the rosette window and the configurations of just the top of the window behind this gathering of the professional baseball players of America. So for the windows, when we refurbished those, we had to replace some of the operable sashes and most of the rosette windows. And because the operable windows were below guardrail height, we had to provide 4-inch limiters so that would take care of kind of operable windows being below the guardrail height. So that was one of the safety hazards, and the 4-inch limiter was how we dealt with that. For residential occupancies, the Historic Building Code has some breaks on room dimensions and light and ventilation. So sleeping areas may be 50 square feet with an average ceiling height of 7 feet. Regular code, that typically requires 70 square feet for any sleeping areas. And then for light and ventilation, windows in habitable rooms shall have an area of 6% of the floor area or 6 square feet, whichever is greater. And regular code requires 8% of floor area. So this is the section kind of talking about fire sprinklers and some of the trade-offs. And so this is kind of coming from different sections of the code. but kind of one of the big ones is section 8-410, where occupancy, use, or distinct fire hazards shall be deemed in compliance if provided with an automatic sprinkler system. So just this collection of fire sprinkler trade-offs that the historic building code allows. So exterior openings close to a property line may remain. There are unlimited floor area provisions, no need for fire retardant finishes, no need to provide 1 hour rated glass, 1 hour rated corridors may not be required. Occupancy separation can be reduced down to 1 hour, no stair or shaft enclosures. This eliminates some distinct hazard classifications, and if you're type 3 or type 5, 1 hour construction, there's no need to upgrade that. So again, this kind of big asterisk is on most of our projects, we are not really able to use many of these trade-offs, but if that's your kind of technique, we definitely recommend to have early meetings with the enforcing agency. So this is some more details about fire resistive construction. So as it relates to the automatic sprinkler systems, with exterior wall construction, the fire resistance requirement for exterior walls and openings may be satisfied with an automatic sprinkler system. 1 hour rated construction and corridors may not be required with a sprinkler system. And any openings, typically if there are historical glazing or solid wood doors that are historic and not rated, that typically should have that 1 hour rating. That can be approved with smoke seals and an automatic sprinkler system. And so there's some added language in the Broadway commercial bulletin that Karin was discussing earlier that also requires self-closing latching devices to prevent smoke penetration, and windows need to be fixed. So going up to the roof level, so the historic building code states that for roof covering, any wood roofing materials may be permitted when they're installed in Class A construction. Fire alarm systems should be per regular code. And then this section 8-412, this applies to a lot of the projects that we do, that says floor or occupants located more than 75 feet over the lowest floor shall conform to regular code for existing high-rise buildings. So several of the projects that were part of the case study, we have kind of a proposed rooftop use or lounge. And so these requirements may apply that include stair pressurization, secondary water supply, smoke control, 2 fire sprinkler connections to the municipal main, plus exiting requirements. So that's typically something that we deal with when we're proposing these new rooftop uses. Going on to means of egress. So for passageways, the historic building code states that door openings and corridor widths with dimensions less than required by regular code may be permitted if sufficient width and height for occupants. For stairs, any existing risers, treads, handrails, and handrail extensions may remain if they're not a distinct hazard. This image on the right is from Broadway Trade, and we typically have a lot of historic stairway configurations. And so the rise or run of the stairs may be a little bit more narrow or higher than regular code, or the handrail may be lower than what's currently required. So we'll typically meet with our plan checker and process a request for modification to so that we can leave those existing stairways in. We may have to make some modifications to the handrail height or to the guardrail, but typically the plan checker is concerned with the consistency of the rise and run of the stairs so that folks kind of get into a rhythm as they're going up or down. For main entry doors, they don't need to swing in the direction of egress if other means are provided. And then, so for the fire escapes, this is something that Karin had mentioned. So for any existing fire escapes, that is acceptable as one of the required means of egress. The fire escape needs to be in good working order and extend to the ground level. And that also needs to be accessed via an opening with a minimum width of 29 inches. With a sill no more than 30 inches above the finished floor. So typically on the case study projects that, that we shared earlier, so Broadway Trade and Broadway Lofts, since we're adding new roof assembly to the roof, typically we need to provide 2 exits that are in the form of new rated and enclosed stairways. For smaller projects, so this image on the lower right here is a residential amenity deck, less than 50 occupants. And so what some of the code officials have been asking for and what we've needed to provide is some form of a level landing and stairs up to that, so that in the event of an emergency, folks that need to use the fire escape can kind of have this landing to kind of gain their bearings. Fire escapes are kind of terrifying, even if you're up a few levels. So just to orient themselves and safely get on the fire escape to exit safely. For new fire escapes, we typically don't pursue those on any of our projects, but there is a section 8.502.6 in the Historic Building Code, and there are conditions set that any new fire escapes need to meet. For means of egress, for escape windows and doors, basements in dwelling units and sleeping rooms below the 4th floor should have at least one openable window into a public way, yard, or court for escape. And the openings need to have a minimum clear area of 3.3 square feet and a minimum width or height of 18 inches. Railings and guardrails, the historic height and spacing of the balusters may continue, with the exception if it's a distinct hazard. So on some of our projects, this is a historic guardrail for Broadway Lofts. But sometimes if the guardrail isn't at the height per regular code, or if the spacing of the balusters is maybe a little bit wider than what is kind of in the current code, what we have done is provided a glass guardrail that's beyond the historic handrail, so that's meeting the 42-inch high guardrail. Plus also nothing is able to pass through the baluster spacing. Moving on to accessibility. So this is your weekly reminder that the ADA is a law and not a code, and following any code, including the CBC, is not complete protection against a lawsuit. For the section in the Historic Building Code, so the purpose is to require enforcing agencies to accept reasonably equivalent alts to the regular code. And so the reasonable is typically where there's a little bit of a need for the discussion with code officials. And so again, it's good to meet with them early to discuss those methods. The intent is to preserve the integrity of historic buildings while providing access and use by persons with disabilities. And the scope applies to all qualified historic buildings that need to provide access to persons with disabilities. And this does not apply to new construction, reconstruction, or replicas of historic buildings. Some of the basic provisions, so the regular code still needs to apply to historic buildings, with the exception of if strict compliance with regular code threatens to destroy historic fabric or character-defining features. So alternative provisions may be applied on an item-by-item basis with documentation and reasons for the application of the alternative provisions. And this needs to be retained on file with the enforcing agency. And so just as a note, this should only kind of be a last resort for any provisions to meet ADA or disabled access, because that doesn't exempt the owner or architect or engineers from the potential of a lawsuit. Some alternatives, so entryways to buildings. So there is still a requirement for a level landing in front of doors, and the access to any entry for the public way that's within 200 feet of the main entry may still be used with wayfinding and notification systems. For doors, they have a hierarchy of some alternatives for door configurations that are kind of listed in order of priority. So they do allow a single leaf door with a 30-inch clear opening. Then the next step down, they give you a ½ inch break. They do allow a single leaf door with a 29.5-inch clear opening. They'll also allow a double door with one leaf that provides the 29.5-inch clear opening, or double doors that have a 29.5-inch clear opening with both doors open and a power assist button. So power assisted doors may be considered as an alternative to providing level landings, but you still need to provide the strike side clearance and door opening forces that are required by regular code. There is a section about toilet rooms. So any access for unisex toilets, that's allowed in lieu of separate gendered toilet facilities. And then for ramps and lifts, so typically where you're not able to meet the 1 in 12 slope for ramps, they do allow some options that give you some steeper slopes. So ramps no greater than 1 in 10 for horizontal distances that don't exceed 5 feet, and access ramps of 1 in 6 for horizontal distances that don't exceed 13 inches. And so the code also states that that we must have signs posted at the upper and lower levels of the ramp, noting the steepness of the slope. So this image on the right is a retail space on Broadway. So you can see that we were still able to provide the clear level landing, but the difference from the finished floor in the retail space and the public way out to the sidewalk, we needed to provide a ramp that was a steeper than a 1 in 12 slope. So we were able to use the code to provide a 1 in 10 slope, but the building department had requested that we place handrails on both sides of the ramp. That's it. I'll hand it off to John and back to CPF. I don't know if we have time for questions. I also lost track of time there.
Great, thank you, Joel. We do have a few questions. Let's see, what's our agenda say? Do we have time for questions? I believe we do. Yeah, we have a few minutes for questions here. It looks like 6 minutes. So maybe I should take these questions as we receive them for this particular case. There was a question in the chat box saying, you mentioned recommended practice is to consult early with the code official. Could you please speak to what a successful workflow or development review process looks like in situations where the CHPC is sought to be used as opposed to the typical planning and building and safety flow?
Sure. So how we've handled that in the city of Los Angeles, I don't know if other cities or jurisdictions kind of use the same terminology, but we're able to schedule a case management meeting, and it's just some paperwork and a fee that you sign up for, and you're able to check off the agencies that you'd like to meet with. So typically it can be the Department of Building and Safety, you can meet with the fire department, and so you can just check the box on who you'd like to be present. Then when you have that meeting, you can kind of come with a list of the items that you do want to discuss. Then we definitely recommend after that meeting, keeping minutes and distributing those back to the officials just to review and sign off on. And because it's very important to keep that as a record to kind of guide your process down the line, because it always, no matter what, it always comes back later in plan check. Someone will say, wait, why are you doing this? And then you have to sidetrack for about a week and then go back, find those minutes and say, no, like we discussed this. But without fail, that always comes up. So any formal process of setting up that meeting, it may be different kind of city by city, but in Los Angeles, it's a case management meeting. And so that's what we recommend.
Also, just to add to that, I think that there's the kind of big picture analysis of the building as a whole that the building official really needs to understand and see before they can make any kind of even early determinations of what, some hazards might be or what would be acceptable. So like really, so for say the architects out there to really be able to show the building official the general exiting plan and what, if any, non-compliant current code conditions there are to kind of, identify those. And so maybe it's not super detailed, but like, yeah, the guardrails are a little low on the stairs and the stairs are open on these 2 floors. And then also the number of occupants. So you're kind of looking at it big picture because they can't really, code officials can't make any kind of determination without having that information. But also for the code official side, I would, I'd really encourage you guys to be able to kind of make some of those determinations as early as possible. Because like, as Joel's saying, you know, a lot of the stuff, even if we present it in the beginning, it comes up in plan check, and then you've already kind of, you know, anticipated that you could use a certain exiting scheme, or you can reuse certain historic features that, you know, we don't want to have to, you know, redo a bunch of stuff and rethink everything later on down the road.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Thank you. We have a few questions here in a few minutes, so I'm going to move on to the next one from Charles. He's asking, do you have experience with increasing hand and guardrail heights above existing heights? Has this worked for your project? I think you briefly mentioned that, Joel, but maybe kind of expound on that.
Yeah, so in some instances, we may come in with a handrail that complies with the height, or sometimes we'll place a guard, whether it's glass or metal, kind of on the side of the stair stringer, just to meet kind of that that regular code requirement. We also have, sometimes there is a pony wall that doesn't meet kind of that height requirement. And so in some instances, we've also been able to kind of rebuild that pony wall and place kind of the historic wood cap back on it, and while still providing new handrails. So those are some of the methods and techniques that we've used on some of our projects.
Yeah, and it's very case by case.
Okay, so I don't see any further questions. We're now, I believe, moving on to a session by Una Gil-Martin from Wisjani Elsner. And so we're going to activate her video and her screen share here, and we'll get started right away.
Okay.